Hello and welcome to Playback, Tier 2 World's weekly showcase of our best stories from around the globe. Coming up, climate protesters scuffle with police in Glasgow as the focus of the COP26 summit shifts to how actions to address the crisis will be paid for. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden agreed to set up a common mechanism to strengthen bilateral relations. A new UN-led report finds all sides in Ethiopia's conflict in Tigray may have committed a string of war crimes. And leaders of the world's major 20 economies agree on a historic corporate tax deal. The United States and 19 other countries have pledged to stop financing international fossil fuel projects by the end of next year. World leaders at the COP26 conference also admitted to spending more on clean energy instead. The pledge comes a day after nations agreed to start moving away from coal power. Mehmet Solmaz reports.
Coal produces more than 37% of the world's electricity. It's the most polluting fossil fuel and the single biggest contributor to the climate change crisis. On Thursday, more than 70 countries signed a pledge to phase out coal-fueled power plants.
Today, I think we can say that the end of coal is in sight. The progress we've seen over the past 2 years would have seemed like a lofty ambition when we took on the COP presidency back in 2019. Who would have thought back then that today we're able to say that we're choking off international coal financing, or that we would see a shift away from domestic coal power?
But some of the world's biggest dependents on coal, including the United States, India, China and Australia, refused to sign the agreement. Some big banks took an initiative to stop financing the coal industry.
So for oil and gas companies, which is a relatively small part of our balance sheet, we will only work with companies that have a credible transition plan to net zero. We've also committed to the fact that we are, not going to lend any more money to coal, and we're going to phase out our lending to coal as well.
Although many developed nations have signed up to an accelerated end to fossil fuels, the poorer countries say the transition is not possible without meaningful financial support.
It's only not on the energy technology, but we also have to consider manpower, skills, the laborers who should be prepared also in dealing with this new set of technologies and renewable energy and low greenhouse gas emission technologies.
Despite global efforts, China remains heavily committed to coal and intends to increase both its consumption and its construction of new power plants in the short term. This Chinese coal seller says he has not heard of COP26, but he knows that his livelihood depends on selling coal.
My whole family sells coal. My son, my daughter and I, we have sold coal our whole lives.
Emissions in most countries have gone back to pre-pandemic levels, but China recorded a 7% increase this year compared to 2019. And with the Chinese coal industry still growing each year, it's unclear whether the efforts made in Glasgow are going to make much of a difference. Mehmet Solmaz, TRT World.
Turkey and the U.S. appear to be on the road to rebuilding their fractured relationship. A meeting between the country's leaders at the G20 summit in Rome lasted longer than anticipated. Turkey's defense purchases, opposing views on Syria, and a recent diplomatic row have seen tensions between the NATO allies hit an all-time high. But the face-to-face talks ended with both presidents commenting on the positive atmosphere. Melinda Nusifora reports from Rome.
A fight over fighter jets has driven a wedge between Turkey and the US.
President, will you raise human rights?
Excuse me.
Give F-16s to Turkey, sir?
Excuse me.
But it seems the leaders are preparing to put the past behind them. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan wasn't expected to sit down with his US counterpart until next week at the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow. This earlier than expected meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit was also longer than anticipated. The scheduled 20-minute talk stretched on for more than an hour.
There's really no substitute for face-to-face discussions and negotiations among the leaders when it comes to building understanding and cooperation.
Despite this friendly greeting on day one of the Rome talks, things have been frosty between the NATO allies. Last week, Ankara threatened to expel the ambassadors of the US and 9 other countries over what President Erdogan says was meddling in domestic affairs. Washington refuses to extradite accused terrorist Fethullah Gulen back to Ankara, and the countries remain at odds over the YPG terror group in Syria.
We expressed our sadness about these terrorist organizations in Syria, such as the PKK, YPG, especially regarding the support they received from the United States, and the regret that this has caused us as a NATO member country.
Their relationship worsened when Turkey brought the S-400 missile defense system from Russia, prompting Washington to kick Ankara out of its F-35 fighter jet program. At a press conference on the final day of the G20 summit, President Erdogan told the gathered media Turkey had already paid more than $1 billion for the F-35s and said he discussed a proposal with President Biden to purchase F-16s instead.
The issue of modernizing our F-16 fighter jets or giving us new ones came to the fore. Currently, our defense ministers are following the process, and I have seen Biden's positive approach to this issue.
The leaders also agreed to improve diplomatic processes in order to build on their G20 breakthroughs. Melinda Nusofora, TRT World, Rome.
Ethiopia's prime minister has pledged that the armed forces will defend the capital with their blood and bones. Abiy Ahmed made the comments as armed rebels from the northern Tigray region continued their advance on Addis Ababa. Meanwhile, a UN report has accused both sides in the conflict of committing violations that could amount to war crimes. John Brain reports.
A ceremony in Addis Ababa to mark the first anniversary of the conflict between government forces and the Tigray rebels. A conflict which has left thousands of people dead and hundreds of thousands living in famine conditions.
We won't forget their deed. We will struggle, fight, and win the battles. Ethiopia, our country, will win.
But in recent days, the Tigray People's Liberation Front has made significant territorial gains. Ethiopia's prime minister is pledging defiance.
Ethiopia will not collapse, Ethiopia will prosper, and it will forever exist with her honour. This pit, which is dug very deep, will be where the enemy will be buried, not where Ethiopia disintegrates. We will bury this enemy with our blood and bones.
A UN report has accused both sides in the conflict of abuses which could amount to war crimes. The UN Secretary-General is making a fresh appeal for a ceasefire.
The Secretary-General is deeply concerned that the recent escalation and widening of armed conflict and the declaration of the state of emergency will only aggravate the human rights situation of the people of Ethiopia. He calls once again for the fighting to stop immediately.
But neither side appears to have any intention of backing down. Further bloodshed seems inevitable. John Brain, TRT World.
The leaders of the world's 20 largest economies have endorsed a historic minimum tax rate on big companies. The deal reached is part of a crackdown on tax havens used by corporations to stash profits. Authorities are praising the agreement, saying it will give policymakers more resources to tackle major challenges like the climate crisis and the pandemic recovery. Paolo Montesilo has the details.
It was their first in-person meeting since the start of the pandemic, and it's already proven productive. G20 leaders have backed a global tax deal that aims to stop large corporations from hiding their money from authorities.
Well, I'm proud that the G20 endorsed the global minimum tax. This is something the United States has been driving for over a year, building momentum up to this achievement. And this is an incredible win for all our countries.
The G20 has agreed to impose a minimum corporate tax rate of 15% starting 2023. It'll apply to companies with at least $850 million in annual revenue. According to the OECD, the agreement is expected to add more than $150 billion to state coffers every year.
This deal opens the path to a true fiscal revolution for the 21st century. It's a fiscal revolution first because there's no going back. It's a fiscal revolution because it brings more justice in the matter of taxation.
The landmark deal now has the backing of 136 countries, representing 90% of global GDP. The OECD says the plugging of fiscal leaks would give governments bigger budgets, which could be directed towards climate adaptation and pandemic recovery efforts. Paolo Montesilio, TRT World.
Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party has swept the general elections despite criticism of its handling of the coronavirus pandemic. The victory strengthens the position of incumbent Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, meaning he's now likely to press ahead with a much-debated economic stimulus package. Shoaib Hassan has the story.
Victory was expected, but its manner and scale have left Japan's incumbent head of government pleasantly surprised.
The lower house election is the election for the nation to choose which party to lead this country. It was challenging, but I really appreciate that the nation showed their willingness to have a stable politic under the LDP and Komeito. Under my administration, I believe they expect us to build the future for the country. I will work even harder.
The LDP was seen to be struggling ahead of the election. The party has dominated the ballot box since it was founded in 1955. Spending only 5 years out of power. But things have changed since the departure of longtime Premier Shinzo Abe. His successor Yoshihide Suga quit after just a year in office. Suga resigned as Japan was struggling with the pandemic and safety concerns over the Tokyo Olympics. And a stagnant economy meant many people saw the LDP losing seats, if not the election. But somehow, Kishida managed to turn things around, taking office just a month before the vote.
The LDP did not lose as badly as I had imagined it would. Actually, the party won the elections because it took more seats in the proportional representation voting. So the LDP had a pretty good battle in the race.
The LDP now holds 261 of the 465 seats in the lower house, 5 fewer than before the election, but still more than enough to run the government on their own. But it also means the buck now stops with them. And if Kishida's new economic stimulus plan fails to boost the economy, he'll face the wrath of a COVID-weary public. Shoaib Hassan, TRT World.
The U.S. Supreme Court is hearing arguments in its biggest gun rights case in more than a decade. It comes in the midst of rising gun violence across the country. But with conservative justices holding a majority on the bench, the case could lead to looser laws. Muttalib Erdogan has this report.
A battle between the U.S. state of New York and the National Rifle Association is about to take the national stage. In 2020, New York Attorney General Letitia James sued the NRA for corruption. She accused the organization's executives of using millions of dollars to finance their lavish lifestyles. And now, the Republican Party-affiliated NRA, one of the most powerful lobbying groups in the U.S., is the one taking New York to court. The U.S. Supreme Court is going to start hearing oral arguments in a case that challenges New York gun laws on Wednesday. The state currently requires people to show a reasonable cause if they want a permit to carry a concealed gun in public. Gun control advocates say New York state law helps prevent crimes and violence. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research has shown that concealed carry laws can increase crime by up to 15%, a major increase for large cities like New York.
If you focus on the number of deaths in this country due to gun violence, a small number happens through assault rifles, a larger number happens through handguns. All of them are wrong.
But others say it's a constitutional right to carry a concealed gun. Latif is a pro-gun activist and the director of New Jersey Firearms Academy and has been teaching Americans about gun safety and their rights to carry and use their guns legally.
Your rights are things that the government is supposed to keep their hands off of, and you shouldn't have to qualify. You don't have to qualify to exercise any of the other rights in the Constitution. But the Second Amendment, New York City feels that they have a right to qualify you for as a matter of public safety.
Last year alone, nearly 20,000 Americans died from gun violence, according to data from Gun Violence Archive. A ruling in favor of the NRA-backed plaintiffs in the case, two men who were denied concealed carry permits in New York, could affect similar laws in other states, including California. And that would likely mean more people will be eligible to carry guns in the US, two big cities, Los Angeles and New York. It could also potentially allow Americans to carry handguns in bars, churches and even airports. Muttalib Erdogan, TRT World, New York.
Lebanon's Prime Minister Najib Mikati has urged his information minister to put patriotic sense above all and step down. George Kordashi has refused to resign after his comments spurred a diplomatic row with Gulf Arab states. An old interview resurfaced last week showing him criticizing the Saudi-led war in Yemen. Shuhaib Hassan has the story.
It's the latest challenge for Lebanon's increasingly beleaguered leadership. A video interview of the country's recently appointed Information Minister, George Kordahi. In it, he calls the Saudi-led intervention in Yemen an aggression and says the Iran-backed Houthi rebels are acting in self-defense. Kordahi says his remarks were made in a personal capacity before becoming minister and sidestepped demands for him to resign.
To those calling for my resignation, I say that I'm a part of a cohesive cabinet and I cannot take such a decision alone, but with the government together.
Those comments incensed the leadership of the Gulf states, and the response was swift. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Bahrain recalled their ambassadors to Lebanon. The six-nation Gulf Cooperation Council, also comprising Qatar and Oman, condemned Kordahi's remarks. Lebanon's Prime Minister Najib Mikati tried to calm the situation.
We are very keen on maintaining the best relations with the Arab countries. Indeed, we distance ourselves from conflicts, but we don't distance ourselves from any Arab position of solidarity with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states.
But Mikati's statement has failed to cool the anger in Riyadh, who expelled the Lebanese ambassador on Saturday and clamped a ban on all exports from the country. Kuwait and the UAE have also followed suit, putting even more pressure on Lebanon's cash-strapped economy, which is heavily dependent on expats working in the Gulf states. But Kordahi's position remains strong as he is backed by Hezbollah, Lebanon's most powerful political group, and a close ally to Saudi Arabia's arch-nemesis, Iran.
We wish upon the countries competing about the situation in Lebanon to look at the Lebanese with mercy. The Lebanese are exhausted. Their money has been lost, and the living situation is very harsh. We, as Lebanese, can't do anything.
Analysts say the whole row is another example of Lebanon's politics becoming grounds for a proxy war between Tehran and Riyadh. And as the row deepens, it is the Lebanese people who will pay the heaviest price. Shuaib Hassan, TRT World.
The importing of foreign cars has been banned in Iran since 2018. That's when former U.S. President Donald Trump imposed harsh economic sanctions on the country. With a drop in the production of locally made vehicles, demand for used cars has gone up. Reza Hatemi reports from Tehran.
At rush hour, traffic comes to a standstill on the streets of the Iranian capital. Commuters stuck for hours in a swarm of Iranian-made cars. Iran's auto industry is second only to its energy sector and accounts for around 10% of the country's gross domestic product. But the market has suffered badly under U.S. sanctions. Production dropped more than 50% in 2019 compared to 2 years earlier, and the sector is yet to rebound. For the past 3 years, foreign car imports have been banned altogether. Even before sanctions, they were expensive. Import taxes of more than 100% were imposed by the government to protect its local industry.
No country can advance its economic and industrial sectors by building a wall around itself. The auto market cannot thrive in such an atmosphere. The future of the auto industry in Iran depends largely on political decisions. If sanctions are lifted, I believe Iran can become a growing market.
And the government's protectionist policies have led to lower quality products.
Local car makers have a monopoly on the market. Rival vehicles are not being imported. That has negatively affected the product quality. In the past few years, our auto industry hasn't progressed the way it should have.
And a drop in the Iranian rial has made buying a car even more difficult. The price for the least expensive brand new car on the market is more than 2 years of the minimum wage. Under sanctions, Iran has limited foreign currency reserves. Officials say the possible resumption of car imports could lead to more inflation. And with prices skyrocketing, second-hand markets like this one are flourishing. Even used cars aren't easily affordable.
You have to sell an apartment to buy a Chinese car. This is not right.
I want to buy a car, but I have to pay 700 million rials for a 20-year-old car. I am a simple government employee. How can I pay for this?
I can't afford to buy a brand new car. I am young, my salary is not high. Now I have to pay 1200 million rials for a Kia Pride.
But the government is planning to improve the market. It has agreed to import tens of thousands of cars next year and is looking to triple its annual production volume to 3 million in 4 years. To do this, the country needs to overcome formidable political and economic challenges. Reza Hatami, TRT World, Tehran.
60 years ago, Germany began a program to bring in workers from Turkey. Millions of Turks left their homes to help fill labor shortages during Germany's economic boom. Berlin admits it's been slow to recognize those contributions to its prosperity. And today's generation of Turkish Germans are still facing old prejudices. Sibel Karkush has their story.
What do I think of guest workers? There are too many here.
I don't think we can manage without them.
6 decades ago, Ankara and Bonn signed a landmark agreement that saw thousands of young Turkish men and women flock to Germany.
Labor force was desperately needed to make Germany's post-war economic boom possible. But they were also needed in light of the social change that happened in Germany. The social advancement of a whole generation of young Germans from working-class families became possible through these guest workers.
Often at the expense of their own. The so-called Gastarbeiter or guest workers worked low-paid and often back-breaking jobs that Germans didn't want to do. They lived cramped conditions, 8 to 10 people in one room in special accommodation, alienating them from society.
There was a first-class guest worker agreement for Italians and Greeks, and my father wondered why we only obtained a second-class deal and fewer rights. Social rights, health insurance, just to give a few examples.
To help the workers, the Turkish government sent labor attaché Bekam Bilaloğlu, who successfully pushed for a revision of the agreement. But with the start of the global oil crisis in 1973, it was ultimately suspended. After all, the term guest worker contained the idea that they had to return once they were no longer needed. Yet many of Turkish workers decided to stay, but finding their place in society was difficult. The German government hasn't made integration easy. Guest workers were often disadvantaged by the education system, and their children had to clear many hurdles to make the jump from school to university.
I remember when my mother complained that I only received a middle school recommendation, my principal said I could go to a high school, but I wouldn't make it. I later successfully finished 2 universities. Now imagine how much knowledge and potential has been lost just because some teacher said you will never be able to study.
Edibe Erol is a neurosurgeon. She says old prejudices meant she always had to be twice as good as her German classmates and colleagues to get where she is today.
The picture I had as a student was that in Germany we could do anything. Where should our disadvantages even be? But the further I got on with my career, I realized that there really is this glass ceiling.
There are now nearly 3 million Turks living in Germany. They've launched more than 80,000 companies and created hundreds of thousands of jobs, thus continuing to keep Germany's economy going. But the Turkish migrants' contributions to German society and cultural diversity may not always be tangible, but is even more valuable. And all they want now is to not be considered guests anymore in a home they helped to build. Sibel Karkush, TRT World, Berlin.
Singer Diana Ross has given fans a glimpse of her first music video in more than a decade. Ross is preparing to release her new gratitude-themed studio album, Thank You, later this week. She rose to fame in the 1960s as the lead singer of Motown Records' hugely successful female group, The Supremes. She thanked her sons for encouraging her to get back in the groove and shoot the video. And in Taiwan, children wearing costumes inspired by the Netflix hit series Squid Game have stolen the show at the annual Halloween parade in Taipei. Little boys and girls in fuchsia onesies gathered in the streets holding fake weapons. But the costume hasn't been a hit everywhere. Several U.S. schools have banned it due to the violent nature of the South Korean drama. Well, that rounds up your week of news here on Playback. Stay tuned to TRT World for the latest stories.